Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
Hello, I'm Edward Hochsmann, author of the Cutter Kauai Sea Adventure series. My books follow the crew of a small Coast Guard patrol boat plucked from normal operations and upgraded by the Director of National Intelligence to support urgent covert missions in South Florida, the Bahamas, and the Caribbean. Each of the 4 novels in the series features a character-driven story told from multiple points of view designed to immerse the reader in the thick of the action. I served for over 20 years as a Coast Guard officer, and the stories include a high degree of technical accuracy and capture the esprit de corps, deep personal loyalty, and humor shared by those in the service. But don't worry, the language in the stories is as clean and non-jargon-esque as I could make it without surrendering the exciting realism. The books center on Lieutenant Ben Wyporick, the young executive officer or second in command of the Cutter Kauai. They follow him while he matures during Kauai's new and hazardous missions, all while courting the beautiful neurodiverse genius, Defense Intelligence Agency analyst Victoria Carpenter. He and his crew are not superheroes or super soldiers, just ordinary professionals who team up to accomplish extraordinary things, ranging from search and rescue to law enforcement to mortal combat with transnational gangs and foreign adversaries. My latest novel, Indy's Inferno, has Kauai assigned to support a Defense Intelligence Agency operation on a tiny French island south of Guadeloupe. The cover for the secret mission is to provide transport and support for a geological research team conducting a routine survey of the small volcanic island of St. Ignatius in the U.S. Virgin Islands. To everyone's surprise, the volcano is discovered to be on the verge of a major eruption. The crew carries on with their secret mission and are returning from the French island when the eruption begins. Ben's superior, Lieutenant Haley Reardon, Kauai's captain, is faced with a difficult decision. Does she take Kauai and her crew into harm's way at St. Ignatius, or risk the lives of 17 people trapped on the island by a contempt ferry boat pressed into emergency service by the Coast Guard? There's another wrinkle. She's been in a secret relationship with Pete Simmons, one of the DIA passengers returning on board Kauai. Can she risk his life as well? And I'd like to read a passage from the book where Haley gets the news of the eruption and must work through the dilemma to the decision. U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Kauai underway in the Caribbean Sea, 31 nautical miles west-southwest of Montserrat. 3:48 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time, the 2nd of July. Haley was still tossing and turning when the phone rang above her bed. She picked it up before the second ring. Captain. Ma'am, this is the OOD, Lee's voice said. Could you come to the bridge, please? Of course, she said as she swung her legs over the side of the bunk. What's going on? We just received a report on chat that the volcano on St. Ignatius is erupting, ma'am. I don't know what to do. Start heading that way and get main control to put the 3rd engine online. I'll be up in a minute. Aye, aye, ma'am. Haley clicked the flash switch and started to dial Ben's number, then remembered he had given up his stateroom to Pete. She clicked the flash again and dialed the mess deck. Mess deck, XO. Ben, head to the bridge. St. Ignatius is erupting. I'll meet you up there. On the way, boss. Haley pulled on her pants and was doing the same with her boots when the sound of a diesel engine starter drifted up from below. As she finished dressing and left her cabin, she almost collided with Pete, stepping out of Ben's stateroom in frozen shock. It was her first sight of Pete since they parted before the mission. Her relief upon learning that he was safe and alive earlier in the evening had been more intense than she had thought possible. In the aftermath of the encounter with the French warship, her mind was free to think about him, but she had to keep her distance for appearance's sake. When she retired to her cabin shortly afterwards, sleep would not come, knowing he was mere feet away in the next room. She wanted to hold him, be with him, just talk with him. But she was the captain, and captains couldn't indulge themselves on their own ship. Pete, clearly affected as well, broke the silence. Captain, what's happening? Haley swallowed and replied, looks like St. Ignatius is erupting. We may have to divert in case we're needed. Pete reflexively glanced back into the stateroom at the young girl asleep in the top bunk and then turned back. I understand. Is there anything I can do? Just keep your side of things under control. She reached out and squeezed his arm. It was little enough, but would have to do for now. We'll talk later. Yes, he nodded, then said, good luck. You too. Now please excuse me. Haley continued past him toward the bridge as he stepped back into Ben's room, finally remembering to breathe. She rounded the corner and bounded up the ladder to the bridge, finding Ben already seated at the central console. She immediately waved off the call to the attention and stepped alongside Ben as he stood. What's the situation? The evacuation is nearly complete, ma'am. 9 civilians, the 5 USGS folks, including Dr. Hernandez, and our 3 UAV guys are all that's left. The last ferry should arrive in about 3 hours. It's one of the old ones that was condemned before we took it over. How soon can we get there at max speed? 4 hours and 20 minutes, but ma'am, Ben said with a look of concern. But what, XO? Ben nodded toward the starboard bridge door and then turned and walked in that direction with Haley close behind. Once they were out of earshot on the starboard bridge wing, Ben turned and said, we're at 40% fuel right now, Captain. If we haul ass for 4+ hours, we'll be down to around 10% when we get there. We couldn't make it to San Juan, much less Mayaguez with that residual. It would be a nail biter just to make it to St. Thomas. And if they and St. Croix get clobbered like everyone's saying, we might be out of options. It was the same ice ball in the gut feeling again. They had to run at flag speed to the island if they were to be there in time to do any good. But if they did that, and the harbors at St. Croix and St. Thomas were closed by ashfall, it might be days before they could get in for fuel. And by that time, they would run short of water as well. Haley put her head down and squeezed her eyes shut. If those 2 islands were wiped out by tsunamis, that is, what then? And that's after the eruption. What happens if that volcano goes nuclear, as Dr. Hernandez feared? It was a search and rescue dilemma. Should she risk 16 lives to save 17? Risk 19, not 16, she corrected herself, remembering the 2 DIA men and their young rescuee. Haley looked up at Ben and did what she swore she would never do. Ben, you know the stakes. What would you do if you were CO? Ben stared back for a few seconds, then said, Captain, you have my support, whatever you decide. But if I had to make the call, I'd go. Maybe they won't need us, but I just couldn't leave those people with their only hope of not getting burned alive dependent on a rickety old ferry. Oh, Ben, here I was hoping you weren't as crazy as me. Okay, we're going in. Ben smiled sadly in return. Yeehaw. She smiled back, reached out, and squeezed his arm. Thank you, XO. Now I need to figure out how to break it to the crew. God help us. Ben nodded sympathetically as they stepped toward the door. We'll need his undivided attention, that's for sure.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Inside the Minds of Authors. I am excited you guys are joining us today. Thank you so much for being part of this new season with amazing authors and incredible books. If you're new to the show, make sure to subscribe. You don't want to miss a single episode. We're here Monday nights with new authors and new books. So we're going to get started because I hope you enjoy that reading as much as I did. So we're going to jump in. Hello, Mr. Edward. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I am wonderful. I have so many questions. First of all, thank you for your service. I love to hear military personnel, whether you're active duty, retired, or just out, which is amazing. And this book has a little bit for everyone. So I'm ready to get started. Want to know, you said you pulled from your background, you pulled from your history. How much is this story connected to you, or is it all fantasy? Tell us.
Well, the story itself, it is fantasy, I suppose, but it would be true in real life if there was a volcano and a Coast Guard cutter was involved. The books that I write are not based mostly on experience. I was a ship driver only for a short time. I was actually an aviator for most of my career. So a lot of this is my making up of stuff. But the world of the Coast Guard is very close. So a lot of my personal friends and acquaintances have been on boats and in these situations. And these stories are as true to life as I could make them. And a lot of the people who have been in the service who have read them have said, yeah, yeah, that's the way it was. I hope to deliver with these books an experience for the reader. The way I tell the stories is from the point of view of the characters. I mean, not in a first person sense, but it's like you're standing alongside them in the middle of the action. So you're actually in the story with the characters.
This one is part of a series that you have going on. Where did this series started from? When did you decide, you know what, I want to start writing? When did that happen?
Well, that's an interesting question. I am an analyst. And when I wasn't doing flying, I was doing analysis of things like the Coast Guard workforce and operations and that sort of thing. So I did a lot of writing of reports. And what I learned was after you leave the accuracy and the relevance of the report, the more interesting you can make it, the more people would like to read them. So I would try to make my reports more kind of like a story where people would follow along and they would actually get more into what was being said in the report. And a lot of people said, you know, I really like reading your reports. You ought to think about writing fiction because I think people would really like it. So I hemmed and hawed and kind of just knocked around a bit for several years. And then I said, well, I'll give it a try. So I'll write a chapter and see if that works out, see if it makes sense, if it looks like if it might work. And it did. So I wrote my first book, went through all the trials and tribulations of figuring out, well, I could make it as real as possible, but my first encounter with the editor said, "You're not going to leave all this language in here, are you?" Because one, people aren't going to understand anything, and they're going to get bored, and they're going to put it down, make it a little less technical. Back to the drawing board, I had to figure out how to strike that balance, thread the needle between keeping the story authentic, but not just turning people off who have not lived in that world. It took me about a year to figure out how to do that with the book. And then I published it. It went out and it did all right. So I started writing sequels. And I'm up to 4 books in this series so far.
It is a hard balance to translate military alphabet soup to regular civilians because after a while you're going something that makes sense even from one branch to another might not translate as well. So I'm glad that you found that balance and were able to say, how do we communicate the story without letting people get lost in the jargon, which is very, very fun. Do you know how many books you're going to have in this series?
I don't know. I'm getting ready to start another one. And I think I might have maybe 1 or 2 after that, because what I'm trying to do is close the circle on my main character, Ben. He's on his second commanding officer right now. Haley's his second one. The first 2 books featured a different officer. I think in this next one, he is going to succeed the captain of the Kauai. And I'll probably have him in this next story and then another story before he finally moves on. And then I'll have to decide what to do.
Okay. That's a hard decision. Are you still interested in sticking with military fiction or are you thinking, I want to jump into other genres? What do you think?
I'd also like to write a little bit of science fiction. And I did publish a couple of short novelettes, and I might take that series up again. It's been several years since I've written in that one. But when I got involved with the Kauai series, it kind of took my focus because I'm actually working full time and there aren't a lot of spare hours in the day to do as much writing as I'd like. I have to focus on one project at a time. So once Kauai is done, I may look at science fiction. I was actually thinking about doing a cozy mystery series featuring the Ben's first girlfriend and then eventually wife, Victoria Carpenter, because she is an interesting character, being neurodiverse. She might be good as a center for some cozy mysteries.
That sounds like fun. That could be a lot of interesting characters coming together.
Uh,
I'm excited that you're giving yourself permission to be open to different things and explore different genres, which is really, really, really fun. Do you have a specific genre that you actually prefer to read, or do you read the same things you write? How does that work?
Oh, I've evolved over time. When I was young, I was very into science fiction, and I got more into historical fiction as I progressed. I do like the action adventure novels, the kind of like the Tom Clancy type books that have been written. If I pick fiction, it would be either a book kind of like that or one by Jeff Shara. Jeff Shara is historical fiction writer. I really, really like his writing because he takes historical events and he actually almost generates a fictional story around that. And I actually borrowed from his style for the writing that I do because he writes from the perspective of a historical figure in the action.
It's a lot of fun. As you've been publishing different books, different styles from novels to novellas, do you have one thing that caught your eye? You're like, oh, I wasn't expecting this will happen in your writing career and publishing.
The big issue is choosing the genre carefully and setting yourself up in terms of the audience. There's a tremendous amount of other things that go into writing a book. The cover is hugely important. It's one of the things that I always just stress out quite a bit because when people are looking to read something, they're generally just flipping through pages on the internet. Your one shot is maybe a few seconds with that cover. Okay. So the stress of getting the cover that catches people attention. The title of the book is huge. Will people grab onto that and read? In terms of being an independent publisher, when you're doing that, you have to select categories and keywords that have the maximum impact. I mean, all that is a tremendous amount of work that's outside of the actual writing of the book. The amount of administrative and additional work that went on with that kind of surprised me.
There is a lot of behind the scenes that most people take for granted, especially when you're doing it all yourself. You're hiring, you're contracting, you're putting these books together, and you're your own small business on top of having your regular job. So I can completely understand. With that in mind, what advice would you give an up and coming author who's thinking, I want to take the leap, I'm going to do this?
I don't know if I'm qualified to give advice, but I'll tell you what worked for me. I write what I know. Okay. But I'm not confined to, okay, I'm only going to write from things I've experienced. I do a lot of research for each novel. I did a tremendous amount of research for the latest one on volcanoes and volcanology, so that if someone who did in fact know that stuff wouldn't look at the book and say, this is nonsense, that wouldn't happen. Okay. The current book that I'm working on is going to actually feature some orcas that are running amok. There have been a series of orca attacks basically around the Mediterranean and the Eastern Atlantic, where the orcas are actually biting the rudders off of yachts and sailboats. And everyone's scratching their head saying, why are they doing that? I thought, well, that might make an interesting story. So I've been researching that to make sure, again, that I don't say something that someone's going to say, they wouldn't do that. So each story involves some research, and you shouldn't be afraid to do that. You shouldn't be afraid to step out. It's nice to have an anchor in a place that you know very well. And the other thing that you need to remember is that world building is very important. It's very important to set the scene for the reader so that the reader can essentially position themselves in the world. So it's important to have knowledge about where you're writing. I put my stories, the cutter is based in Florida because I'm familiar with the area. It operates in the Caribbean. I've been all around those islands down there when I was on active duty. I'm familiar with the weather, how things look. You go down there, you see flying fish. Most people have never heard of flying fish, but you go down and they're all over the place. I remember the first time I saw one, I thought, what are those birds? and, and it's like, oh my God, they're flying fish. I include those in the story as well. So that you have the same wonder that I did when I got down there the first time. And that's what you want to do is try and find something that puts the reader outside of their normal world because they're reading because they want to go somewhere else. It's my opinion.
Love the fact that you give information in terms of world building because it is still contemporary, but at the same time, you still have to set the stage. You have to bring your readers into the story and have them connect. They need to care about something. So, research, you mentioned it, you do a lot of it. Do you even do research on topics that you're familiar to make sure they're still relevant? How do you work that?
My best friend is Wikipedia. There are several other sources most people haven't heard of. There's actually Scholar Google. Okay. Scholar.google.com. It's like google.com, only it essentially is a database of literature that the people write in college. So if you're doing research for a paper or something, you could go to Scholar Google and find all sorts of references for your paper. And it's likewise when I'm doing a topic, I'll go and, for instance, the latest one, I would look up volcanic eruptions, volcanic explosions, and things like that. And there'd be all sorts of scientific papers that I could look up. Likewise, even with the military stuff, it's important to keep current and to know what's available and what's not. The patrol boat that I write about is not a conventional Coast Guard patrol boat. As I said, the spooks have taken it over. And so they're upgrading it with gear that would not normally be found on a Coast Guard patrol boat. So I've had to do some research to say, okay, what can really happen out there? Can a patrol boat have different sensors? Can it have different capabilities? So I'd have to look up and say, okay, what's reasonable for that? Can it do this? Can it do that? Okay, again, it's all part of the thing to ensure that it's credible. I mean, it doesn't have to be real. There isn't a real patrol boat that works for the director of national intelligence, as far as I know. But it's important that if there was one, that it would be believable. So yes, I still do some research into the stuff that I've been at before.
You take great care to make sure that your audience and your readers are paying attention to those details and that they believe it and that they connect with the story. So that's really, really appreciated. So tell me, Mr. Edward, where can our listeners find you, where they can learn more about these books, where they can connect with you?
I have a web page. It's www.edwardhochsmann.com. It includes pages that show all my books, where they can be found. If you query my name on Amazon or any of the other major retailers, you can find my books there. I have an email at info@edwardhochsmann.com. If people are interested and want to ask me any questions, I'll be happy to reply when I get their emails. If you go on the website, you can send me a message from there.
Love it. To our listeners, go ahead, sign up for the newsletter because I'm sure Mr. Edward has one. Join the community, check out the books. You don't want to miss out. Mr. Edward, before you leave us, are you ready for the lightning round?
Oh, I suppose I'm girded for it.
You got this. Super easy. Pepsi or Coke?
Pepsi, diet.
Nice. Hey. Pancakes or waffles?
Waffles.
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Trek.
Okay. Hiking or camping?
Hiking.
Here's a little different. Let's see how you do with this one. One word that best describes you.
It's funny.
I like. Nice. Perfect. Mr. Edward, it has been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. I've enjoyed the conversation. I'm so glad you're here. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
I'd like to say just keep reading. Help us out. If you read a book and you enjoy it, please leave a review. We live and die by those. You do us a great favor when you do that. And I wish you all what we say in the Coast Guard, fair winds and following seas.
I love that. I need to remember that. Thank you so much, Mr. Edward. Have an amazing day. To our listeners, go ahead, pick up this book, get lost in this series. You are truly going to enjoy it. Remember, we'll be back next week with another amazing author. So make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss an episode. And I'll see you guys again. Bye.